In the last section, we covered the ternary logic of legislation and the ternary logic of the judiciary. In this section, we're going to cover the ternary logic of trifunctionalism overall and the laws of the universe and the tragedy of that continuous adaptation. This is the ternary logic of trifunctionalism. Now, you can see I'm working my way from the jury to the rights, all the way up to the legislature, judiciary, and I've worked my way up now to trifunctionalism. And the logic is the magicians, warriors, the magicians, meaning the warriors, the judges, and the priests. So we had these three peerages, and they were all sort of balanced with each other, with the feminine priesthood, the masculine warriors, and the neutral judges. And this has stayed with us. This created a competition between elites under the neutrality of our law, and this is one of the secrets of our continuous adaptation. It means that, unlike others, we didn't unite the priesthood and aristocracy. We maintained those two things as separate. We didn't perform monopolies we didn't even go to the point where you have the Chinese state and its monopoly, or the Middle Eastern state and its mixed theocratic military monopoly. We have this wonderful trifunctionalism that keeps a competition between these elites. And since everybody is limited by every other, it forms this wonderfully adaptive structure. So if you need warriors, if you need commerce, if you need priests, or public intellectuals, or people to organize people positively, you have a pool of professionals or elites that specializes in expressing that particular need. So our secret is one of continuous adaptation. The law is only a via positiva means for resolving differences. It's the work of the middle class. The military and state do what's necessary for the state, and the church or the faith defends the interests of the family, peasantry, women, and children. And this equilibrium prevents the state or the church or economic interests from obtaining a monopoly of authority, as we've seen in other parts of the world. And instead, it creates a market for compromise and exchange between the elites and the institutions on behalf of our people. Now, you could say that there's this attempt by the Marxists to say that the Western civ is unfair, but it's just the opposite. It's, if you're a woman, you'd rather be in the West. If you're a poor person, you'd rather be in the West. It's not that things can't always get better, but the problem is everything else is actually worse. If you want to look at the group strategy, it produces what I call perfect government as a bit of a bait to our enemies. But it's the natural law of evolution by conscious creatures, self-determination by self-determined means, by sovereignty and demonstrated interests, and reciprocity in display, word, and deed. Once we remove authority and we limit ourselves to voluntary cooperation, we're stuck with markets in everything. And that's good, because markets are adaptive, not maladaptive or stagnating. So we have markets for association, cooperation, production, reproduction, the family, goods, services, information, and commons. We put together a constitution of natural law. We did it on the step through verbal agreement, and we've continued this trend through, whether it's by tradition or written, in the first strong implementation in Britain, or the stronger implementation in America, and what I would consider the final articulation of it in my work. You have this constitution of natural law that limits us to these market functions. You have a state that consists of the inventory and assets of the people, a monarchy that's the judge of last resort. Now, when I bring up monarchy, I get crap all the time by these idiots that think I mean dictatorship. No, I mean Queen Elizabeth. She doesn't have the power to do anything except restore rule of law. Well, that's what you want. The end result of just like the end result of philosophy is putting into science everything that's totally known, the end result of government is a monarch that only is via negativa, restoring the natural law. And so it's not like this monarch has a lot of discretion. This monarch's job is to identify excellences, rewards, knightships, these things, which is what Elizabeth does, and to throw the bums out, and call in the military if anything gets out of hand, which it has clearly done in England. I mean, if we had a monarch today, we wouldn't be in this position. The best countries in the world are still monarchies, even in Europe. And this is a reason, but this is one of the things that prevents us from converting from an ethnocentric kinship kingship state to a multicultural, non-national, high power distance corporation at the expense of the host people. We have a military that's the defender of last resort, the interior that's the insurer of last resort, the treasury, which is the financier or bank of last resort. We have houses of government for the market that creates a market for the production of commons. We create a cabinet and a bureaucracy for the professional administration of those commons, although in America we do it wrong. In Germany they do it right. We have a judiciary, which provides a market for the resolution of disputes. We have the common law, which is legislation and findings of the court, in other words, an empirical record of the market for the resolution of disputes. We have citizens, in other words, those people who will ensure, by force of arms, under promise of warranty and liability, of the preservation of the self-determination by self-determined means, by demand for sovereignty and demonstrated interest and reciprocity and display were in need. That's what a citizen is, an insurer. Everyone else isn't a citizen. Everyone else may be a resident, or may be a dependent, or may be unfit. But if you're not engaging in reciprocity in the insurance of natural law, then you're not a citizen. You can't be. That's the criteria for citizenship. Then I'm trying to explain why Christianity was pretty important for us. Because we went from a homogeneous people of ethnocentric with shared interests to a huge empire where we had a lot of people who were a permanent underclass. So we went from a European 99 IQ to Middle Eastern 85 IQ, and we tried to administer that. Well, at the same time, we imported a lot of people from around the world, and we let our underclass, our women in our underclass, form a unified political interest with people of other foreign underclasses. We created an incentive that needed some positive means of integration into an aristocratic society that treated the bottom as domesticated animals. So the sovereignty prohibits authority, and the rest of the world chose authority in harmony and adaptive and evolutionary difficulty. In other words, they chose to limit the difficulty of adaptation and conflict resolution. It's what they chose. They chose a simpler, more harmonious model because they couldn't produce the high trust necessary to produce an adversarial model. Our model is adversarial, it's competitive markets, but it's competitive markets where there are elites for every class, always competing to maintain the benefit of that class. I'm sorry, chose is the wrong word. They evolved into something other. And this is natural because, as we talked about in geography, the geographic problems of the Nile, of the Tigris Euphrates, of the Levant, of the Indus River Valley, of the European forests, of the Chinese river valleys, take any region that's occupied by humans that produced a subrace, in other words, a people who adapted genetically and culturally to their environment, you'll find they were forced into that by circumstance. So the rest of the world didn't choose, they were forced into or deterministically resulted in authority. Of course, then once you're aware of what I'm saying, now you're choosing. The rest of the world selected for authority and harmony, and the consequence was adaptive and evolutionary difficulty, whereas we selected for law, markets, and adversarial excellence or meritocracy in service of the commons, producing continuous adaptation at the cost of the unfit and the stress of constant adaptation. So, I mean, this is really the problem, is that Western civilization is costly. It's psychologically, emotionally, and physically costly because we started out as a corporation. It's even though we evolved into ethnocentric corporations, our ethic is one of corporations. So the members of a corporation have to produce commons, in other words, common goods, whereas most other civilizations are trying to produce familial goods or clan goods or tribe goods.
It's quite different.
So the difference that I think is so beautiful, because you have the tragedy of Achilles, which is really the Bible of the ancient world. It's the Bible of the Greek and Roman world. There was just as much written about the epic cycle, which is the the book of the Iliad and the Odyssey. There's only a small part of the epic cycle, and we've lost a lot of it. But the tragedy of Achilles is for warriors, for aristocracy, and it's about making you, the warrior, human. And the same thing is for the tragedy of Jesus, which is they created an Achilles for the underclass, and the tragedy of the bottom. And this mirror image, aristocracy and peasantry, and masculine and feminine. Christians hate it when I say Christianity is feminine, but I mean, it's feminine. It's certainly not heroic, militaristic, expansionist, technological, scientific, empirical.
We're in agreement.
I mean,
I understand.
I mean, the point is that Christianity spread like woke spreads. It spread through women because women have a natural tendency, for a variety of reasons we've already covered. And so it spread through women, and from women to the underclass, women were gaining power. And then the church was taken over by men once they understood that there was power from it, and they drove the women out of it. Somewhat like in your profession, childbirthing, drove the women out. And so with the only cure for reciprocal insurance being reciprocal love, I've said this better elsewhere. So both our ancient religions don't tell us what to do. They tell us how to tolerate what we do and must do. What that is endure the tragedy of the laws of nature and the universe that are all but hostile to man, with the heroic love of one another, whether as the masculine warriors or the feminine Christians, that heroic love of one another, at least, all of whom will do their duty to love one another. And that duty is the secret to our loyalty. Status is earned by that duty regardless of rank or wealth, because in an army, every single person is dependent on every other. But this is also true of Christianity. You're creating an army of care. And what it does is allow you to have status despite not being wealthy or powerful or male. And it solved this enormous problem of this treating the underclass as slaves. And it provided an interesting solution to the problem of Western civilization. This is why I say Jesus was right. Whether he existed or not, whether someone wrote that stuff, I don't know. But the fundamental answer is he was right. The science is very simple. There's only one solution to the prisoner's dilemma of cooperation, and that is to be the best you can. Forgive until you can't forgive, until it's impossible to forgive. And so this is actually the optimum strategy. And so is love. I mean, we live in the most expensive civilization. We have the most adaptation, which causes the most psychological, emotional, and physical stress, under the most change with the least sense of security, and constantly subject to adversarial markets that producing commons for the collective rather than ourselves. Well, what's the answer to that? There's only one. It's either to maintain the upper class domestication of human underclass animals, which is not very nice, or it is Christianity, which tells us the only way to adapt to God's laws, which aren't nice, God isn't kind, he isn't sweet, he isn't loving. He gave you these incredibly hostile laws that force you to adapt at all times to his laws through a continuous process of incremental stresses, which the only solution to which is love of one another.
Contrast that with the Marxist thought.
It's hate.
I know.
It's hate.
But is it interesting that it's anti-Christian? It is interesting to me that it is the mobilization of resentment and hatred and negative emotionality for power.
Power, and also power at the promise of non-adaptation. In other words, they're lying to you. They're telling you this: you can have these gains without continuing to obey the laws of nature, and moreover, continuing to invest in the commons and continuing to love one another, all that come at personal sacrifice.
But Marx said it correctly. He said the church is the opiate of the people. And it's not so much the opiate, but it palliates the human condition.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between what Jesus said and the church. So I'm a Jeffersonian Christian, which means I treat Jesus as a philosopher, just like Thomas Jefferson did. If you haven't read the Jefferson Bible, it's worth reading. It's the only thing it's the only part of the Bible worth reading. And all he did is cut out what he actually said, and it wasn't magical, because we know the magical stuff was added later. So it's a profound work of moral philosophy. But what's beautiful is the science says it was right. So my view is, whether Jesus is the work of an individual or a group, or he's the work of generations, I don't know the answer. That produces the correct answer, the only answer to the problem of scale, and that's love. It's exhaustion of forgiveness. And Jesus solved the problem. He solved the problem. How do you bring in 85 IQ people into an aristocratic, hyper-adaptive, militaristic, expansionist, heroic, commons-producing corporeal civilization in the total absence of familial, social, religious security? He solved the problem. It's not a non-trivial problem. It's one of the biggest problems in human history. So are you Christian? Well, I'm a Christian in the sense that I understand the words of Jesus of Nazareth, so I call myself a Jeffersonian Christian because the science says it's true.